Hello, Iris J here with Madrona's Pulse Teachings. That's Nikita right on cue. And I am making just a 4-video series, really giving a little bit more attention to working with the elements. And so I'm going to talk with you about air energy and really working and embodying air energy and nourishing, hopefully productive ways. This is important for so many different reasons. Firstly, if we're just talking about astrology, understanding and having especially embodied, and I'm going to talk about embodiment, understandings of and appreciations of the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water. These are the foundations of the chart. They're the foundations of astrology in some ways. They're the foundations of earth-based spirituality. They're the foundations of ancient practices of connecting with our environments and the earth in a way that is nourishing and healing. And we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of years of different global indigenous practices, many of which are still alive in many different ways, some ways flourishing, other ways have been completely silenced by, especially in the modern age, through the rise of, yes, patriarchy, also industrialization, and the way that all of these different periods of human history interact and impact how we make meaning and how we interpret meaning. And working with the elements, firstly, in our own journeys of healing and spirituality, it can take us so far. It can bring so much to feeling grounded and safe in every moment in our body. And all of the elements are part of this. And then our natal chart can show us elements that are really emphasized in this life, in our personality and in our psyche's makeup. And by seeing what's emphasized, it also shows us what we may need to mindfully and intuitively lean into when we're kind of feeling dysregulated or out of balance. So working with the elements is really, really important. And there is a lovely book, if you like reading astrology books, by Stephen Ario, who's one of my favorite astrologers to read, who has a book all about the 4 elements and how important they are in any astrology practice, whether you are coming in through traditional or evolutionary. I do practice Western astrology and evolutionary astrology, archetypal astrology. I also consider it a decolonial astrology. And so the elements are just so important. So here I'm going to talk about air. So firstly, making connections between air and astrology. Air shows up most strongly through the 3 air signs, which are Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. And we also have air houses. So in the zodiac, the air houses are the 3rd house, the 7th house, and the 11th house. And so these are some of the places where air energy really shows up. And of course, also when the air is in our natal chart. And then of course, when there are big transits in air. So for instance, at the time I'm making this, we have Pluto, who's just entered into Aquarius, a new manifestation on a deep soul level of air energy. We're going to have Jupiter in 2024 move into Gemini. Then following later on will be Uranus moving into Gemini. So we're actually entering into some new manifestations of air energy for the collective and then for us individually. And let's just talk about air energy. So it's most often thought of as thoughts, imagination, language, communication, the need to express, the need to explore the incredible ways of that we can be human, that we can imagine a future, that we can intuit understanding and information. Air is also information in the traditional sense of communication. And you know, the thing about air energy is sometimes I'll hear folks say, Well, I'm not supposed to be in the body. I'm supposed to be this thinking mind. Okay, let's interrupt that a little bit, okay? So we are in this human experience, which is to be an embodied being. And so, firstly, our mind and our body are always connected in this body, and we can absolutely approach air energy with an embodied perspective. And I would suggest that this is essential, especially if you live with anxiety. And so anxiety is one of the go-to responses to a lot of air energy, or to getting stuck in air energy. Because what anxiety is actually when we're becoming disembodied, when we're getting stuck in air energy, when we're getting stuck in thought. If you have a mindfulness practice or a meditation practice, often that practice, and this is a practice of thousands of years, not just part of the modern mindfulness movement, is training awareness to become aware of how constant thought is, and to see how we can actually get stuck in giving a kind of formalized belief to the reality of thoughts, when really thoughts are just like the wind blowing through the system, blowing through the consciousness. And when we come into air energy through an embodied perspective, we are grounded. We are grounded while also being able to go on these incredible journeys of thought, of sometimes receiving downloads of information. This is something that's aligned with Aquarius energy. And working with information, I am an astrologer. I also come through a lot of education and formal education, and I'm a teacher, and I often implore students in the university to realize that conceptual thought is an art form, and it can be an incredible art form. And just like, sorry, I'm going to go ahead and say it, just like a lot of pop music is reproducing something that sells, something that works, a lot of conceptual thought, whether it's academic writing or nonfiction, is it always a cutting edge art form? No, of course not. Can it be? Absolutely. Just like music can transcend this plane, especially when we get into the vibrational level of it. Thought can take us there. We can go into incredible healing realms with air energy. We can connect with other individuals and other minds and spirit itself through air energy. And that is why the imagination is so important. And whether we are working with Gemini air, Libra air, Aquarius air, the imagination is essential. And the imagination lets us literally imagine a path that is different than what we have come from. When that imagination is interacting with an interrelated web of all of life, and it's coming through the medium, and I use the word medium as if it is an aesthetic art medium of thought and ideas, we can construct whole new planes, right? And this is why certain writers offer us narratives that construct whole new envisions. I am really thinking pretty strongly of Starhawk, if there's any Starhawk fans out there, especially her work in fiction and imagining a world, where we do things differently, where we embody power and relationship with different drives. And when we come into a practice of really centering the elements in our life, Starhawk also coming out of certain Wiccan practices, which are all about the elements and respecting and honoring and co-creating with them. We have a different organization of human society. And so air energy is essential to imagining that. It's essential to allowing it to become. And yet, if we are just getting stuck in air energy in our thoughts, we're often going into a place of control. And this is complicated because Western traditions of thought and education actually approach language through a structure of control. They approach writing. If you come into writing through a formal education system, especially if you go into university or went through university, the approach to writing is often this idea that I already know what I'm going to produce before I've even potentially done some of my research, before I've come into the writing process. Air energy, when it is empowered, is coming from a place of co-creation with others, with myself, and with spirit. And that is kind of the progression of Gemini air energy. Is very curious. It is able to move between different perspectives. It sometimes has a sociable quality to it, because it's like this ability to, and a desire to understand different people's perspectives, because it's trying to also understand the immediate environment. And in order to do that, we need different perspectives. And Gemini is also a fast moving energy, and sometimes it can get so fast, and that's where it can spur an incredible amount of anxiety. It can get stuck between perspectives, and it can also lose track of itself. And how do we work with that? Well, we have to bring in some grounding practices. And here, we also lean into, when we want to ground, we lean into what's opposite. Opposite of air energy is fire energy. That is a quick discharge of energy. If I am stuck in my head, move my body. If I am stuck in a repeating pattern of thought, firstly come into breath, which is air energy connecting to the body, and also a movement practice there. It brings me back into the body, but it brings into it through movement. And that is also helping the spirit of fire energy, which is moving and getting the channels flowing within my whole body-mind complex, resetting the nervous system and creating space literally within the mind, because the body and the mind are always linked. Also, just allowing a cathartic outpour of language can also be working with fire energy, whether I just do it in the shower or the bath, or I use my phone and I record it, or I just go out into the woods and I speak with spirit through nature. But a discharge can also be important. It's often important to get that discharge, not necessarily at another person unless it's carved out in like a therapeutic setting. But that the discharge has to happen, especially when we're stuck in air energy. And that could happen with Gemini, that can happen with Libra, and that can happen with Aquarius. Libra is air energy that is really in a one-on-one, in a dyad situation. And that can be with another person. It can also be with ourself. Sometimes Libra energy actually really needs to be in a dialogue with the self in order to understand what the self is feeling. Because sometimes when Libra is solely focused on another person, it gets pulled into supporting what the other person needs and wants, and it can forget about itself, and then it gets out of whack, or it's becoming a people pleaser. But it's working with the exchange of idea. It's working with the idea, especially in terms of the way that ideas can weave justice, can create equality. And yet again, if they're just ideas, if they're not becoming embodied, if they're not working in and creating new shifts in our daily practices and the way that we live our life, then we have what's sometimes called, it's sometimes called something like in working with justice movements, we have #feminism. We can use social media in ways that are wonderful, and we can also have people just spewing things out on social media saying, yes, I support this, and living a life that is actually absolutely contradictory to whatever movement we are working with. Or we can have a giant movement like Me Too, which can create some wonderful change, and it can also just create new opportunity for a media industry to make a lot of money, and create situations for people with a lot of power to pursue justice, and also leave everyday people, single moms, survivors of in very intense sexual violence that's completely silent still. You know, we can see things not changing. And that's, again, where we're just working on an information level, and we're not embodying the air energy. And air energy is just part of an integrative system of other elements manifesting that wants to be embodied and brought into life. And Aquarius. Aquarius is air energy that in its truest form is working with higher mind. And so this is lovely because it's actually looking at the way, whether we use language of spirit or interconnection. We could go into quantum theory here. However we come into the meaning-making process, Aquarius energy is simultaneously allowing us to individuate from a status quo while connecting to an evolutionary imperative for the collective. And that is ultimately aligning with higher self, which is incredible air energy. And because it's so incredible, Aquarius energy, all air energy, but also Aquarius energy can zap the nervous system. We can get downloads. The nervous system can get, it can just be too much too fast. We can have a physical fallout there. We can get headaches. There's so many different ways that it can manifest. It can just manifest as an incredible anxiety. And again, we need to come into practices that redistribute some of that information through the whole body. We need to come into practices that allow us to be in more of a balance with our air energy. And this often means leaning into the opposite. So again, that's fire. It's using whatever practices get us in touch with our source spirit energy, which is fire, which is a creative drive. If we're getting carried off into air energy, we might be getting carried off in cycles of thought. We might be getting stuck in switching between those perspectives. We might just be writing ourselves in circles. Okay, this is often something that happens if we just use ordinary, explicit language, especially if we come into certain healing practices, whether they're traditional therapy. Traditional therapy is not working with the four elements. It's working with constructs of wellness that are only accessed through explicit cognitive driven modes of information making, and they come out of a research tradition that is particularly problematic when we're looking at marginalized experiences, neurodivergence, when we're looking at an idea of wellness that is not colonial or patriarchal. Again, coming into earth-based practices integrated with the gifts of wellness traditions in the West, which is my polite way of saying the gifts of things like traditional psychology and psychotherapy. It can really create a more integrative practice. And so air energy it's beautiful, and ultimately we want to open the imagination. One of the things that happens when we are living with an incredible amount of stress, when we are living with an incredible amount of complex trauma, when we are weighted down by the very real realities of this life, is that the imagination and its openness starts closing. And that is usually mirrored in the body closing. And so that's why art practices that really bring about an imaginative freedom, a liberation of the spirit through thought and communication, whether it is communicating through paint or through poetry or through music, it can completely reprogram us, and it can free the imagination. Because when we're stuck in cycles of anxiety, we are projecting the past onto the future, and we are getting taken out of the present moment. And this has everything to do with air energy, and it has everything to do with air energy actually being dysregulated from embodiment. And so it's so important to work with air energy from a perspective of embodiment. And here are some seeds to implore you to be excited about that. And I'm going to leave it there. Okay, be well.